Thank you for being patient. We're now going to start the panel discussion. And what I would like to do is to start for each panel member just to introduce themselves very briefly to the audience.
한국 은성중공업 서용식 대표입니다. 알루미늄 레저 보트를 제조를 하고 수출도 좀 하고 있는, 그래서 굉장히 이쪽 ISO나 RCD 표준 기준에 대한 관심이 굉장히 많고요. 네. 그리고 옆에 계신 분은 이제 정일권 KMI 회장님이십니다. 그리고 FRP 보트를 전문으로 만들고 아직은 이제 국내 제작이 중심이지만 조금 더 이제 노력을 해서 이제 해외 수출까지 연간 한 100척 정도 보트를 만드는 노력을 하고 있습니다.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Alistair, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Alistair Ray. I own and CEO of HPI Verification Services. We have a license from the European Commission to certify boats and components to the European Recreational Craft Directive. We're also licensed by the UK government for the UK equivalent, and other places, Saudi Arabia even, to certify marine products for Saudi Arabia. Personally, I'm a naval architect, and I am vice chair of the European Committee of Certification Bodies for the Recreational Craft Directive. So it is my job to take questions from industry on interpretation of standards and legislation, and to come with guidelines for how to resolve those. So I'm happy to talk about the generality of legislation or even the mathematics of the equations in standards, wherever you would like to take the discussion.
So Patrick, you're not a tourist here today. You work in Korea, you're a regular visitor. And so if companies want to engage with you with specific detailed discussions, they can do that. You can make appointments with them, you can visit their companies and help them directly.
Yes, our company is traveling all over the world all of the time, and we have representation all around the world. We do have representation here in Korea. At the moment, it's only trained up to do other activities with pressure equipment, not marine, but that will come. In time, that will come. So yes, we are visiting regularly.
Patrick, the audience already know you well. You don't need to introduce yourself. But your boss, Joe Lynch from ICOMIA, the CEO of ICOMIA.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to join you today. We are thrilled with the progress being made by the Korean Marine Industry Association and delighted to welcome you to the ICOMIA family. I need to tell you I'm not a technical expert. I'm just here to represent ICOMIA and to listen and to understand how we might be able to help you in whatever way we can. Thank you.
So you had the presentation from Patrick. For some of you, it will have been just so easy and so simple to understand, I'm sure. For others, it might be a bit more challenging. I want to talk about that part now of the work we have to do, the issues, the challenges that we face. One of the things that I've been working in Korea here, this is my 14th year. I come from a very established businessy background. I had a big successful business, which I happily sold, which means that I've never had to work again. But I stayed in contact. And the great pleasure of watching what's going on in here, Korea, is to see how quickly the industry has developed, how good the boats are now becoming, how fantastic the new technology is here that's being developed in Korea. And what I want to get the panel to now consider is how we address some of those problems. ISO standards, recreational craft directives, it's a mountain. It's a mountain. The problem is that in Korea, you have a very sophisticated customer. It's a well-developed, sophisticated market. And so the challenge now in the development of your industry is going to be working towards meeting the customer expectation. The customer expectation in terms of quality and safety. And that's the journey that I want to start to discuss now with the experts here on this panel. The challenge for you is that if there is a standard, and if there is a quality standard and a safety standard anywhere in the world in the recreational industry, then if there was a terrible thing happening and the lawyers start to get at it, the lawyers will look for not what you did, but what you should have done. And the law here would be the same as anywhere else. The law would consider you as an expert in what you do. And so what we're going to try and do now is to work out how you take simple steps to become matching with, compliant with equal to other countries in the world who are also experts in the leisure marine industry. So my first question is going to be to Alistair. Alistair, behind you is the list that Patrick put up. What are the, in your opinion, and you've been around this industry for a long time, just give three things which you think are absolutely, you've got to do. These are the first three things that you should consider. Go home to your office tomorrow, sit down and think about it. What are you going to write on your to-do list? The three things that you should think about if you're a boat builder.
Okay, I will answer your question, but you've just inspired me to start with an example. What you've just said about an incident. Imagine you've built a boat and unfortunately there's a fire on board and somebody doesn't get out of the boat and dies in that fire. There's an investigation and they find that person was too short to reach the escape hatch and get out of the boat. Now there is a standard, one of the standards referenced here, that says that the maximum step height to reach an escape is 1.2 meters. So if you built a step of 1.3 meters, then you're in trouble. A fine, certainly, maybe jail. If you build a step height to 1.1 meters, then you're in the clear, no liability. It's just an accident. And that is the power of standards. So it's very, very important that you build your boat to standards, ISO maybe, ABYC standards, but build to standards. For some markets, they will tell you which standards you must use, but you must use standards. So to come to the question, which three would I pick? Actually, I wouldn't even pick the fire one. There are more important ones even than that. I would pick stability and buoyancy, ISO 12217. Is a very critical point. It's basically how water getting into places of the boat where you don't want it to go. So down flooding is not the case when it goes into a cockpit which is draining, quick draining cockpit, that's where the water has special drains to get it overboard. But it is down flooding if it gets into accommodation areas where the water could sit.
And there's a speed test there, isn't there? The water must drain in a certain way at a certain speed.
Yes, certainly if there is a danger of down flooding, then that's acceptable if it drains within a certain time, and the time that it must drain depends upon how big the volume of the recess is compared to the size of the boat. Depends on the criticality, but yes. Or else you avoid down flooding and put decks and so on.
And now you were mentioning stability.
Yeah, so stability and buoyancy I put together there because there's a trade-off between the stability and buoyancy. If your boat has flotation to survive when swamped, then it's acceptable to reduce the degree of stability, or else if you don't have flotation, then you need to have very good stability. So there is, in the ISO standards, there's a trade-off between stability, buoyancy and down flooding.
Just pause there for a moment. Anybody in the audience got a question on what Patrick's just said on buoyancy and stability? Everybody understand? Rods, good, carry on.
Okay, so that's the first standard. The other two that I would choose would be systems. Fuel is critical, particularly if you're using petrol fuel. Every country in the world would expect your boat not to explode because of ignition of vapors. So the fuel standard tells you not just how to arrange your fuel system, but the requirements for the components that you buy. So permeability of fuel hoses, the resistance to heat and flame of fuel filters, these are all stipulated in the fuel system standard. And the next one I would say would be electrics. There's a famous example of another accident in America where an electrical conductor from the DC system came loose on a terminal board and dropped to contact an AC conductor on the terminal board. And the problem then was in the marina, the whole AC supply from the shore was earthing through the engine into the water, and unfortunately killed a swimmer swimming by. Now, that could have been prevented by a physical partition between the AC and DC, which is a requirement in the international standards to have that physical protection. So there's another example of a real terrible accident that could be prevented by something so simple. And maybe you don't think about these things. That's why we have standards. So electrical standard would be my next choice.
Thank you. Mr. Su, I know you have a large company building boats. I know the quality of your boats is very good. What do you think about the steps that we must take here in the industry through the Korea Marine Industry Association to get boat builders to be aware of some of these issues? What's your advice and guidance?
천의 응성중공업이라는 회사에서 왔습니다. 지금 저는 이제 한 30년 가까이 지금 알루미늄 선박을 제작하는 전문 기술자고요. 그리고 이제 현재는 이제 카타마란 요트하고 그다음에 이제 여객선들을 많이 제작을 하고 있어요. 그리고 이제 특수선들을 워낙 제작을 많이 했다 보니까요. 해양경찰청이라든지 해군 쪽에 선박들을 많이 납품을 했던 장본이기도 하고요. 지금 이제 한국 같은 경우는 지금 ISO 룰을 저희는 기본적으로 따르고 있습니다. 지금 현재 기본적으로 따르고 있는데 한국에 있는 이제 수상내자 안전법이 있고 또 선박법이 따로 있습니다. 그래서 해수 법령에 맞춰서 선박을 건조하다 보니까 오히려 좀 ISO 룰보다는 더 과한 상황이라 해양내저 쪽이 발전을 좀 못하고 있는 실정이다고 보시면 될 것 같아요. 그래서 이제 좀 이거는 한국 정부에 관한 이제 법령이다 보니까 이거는 여러 가지들을 조율을 해야 되지만 저희는 기본적으로 스탠다드는 IS 룰을 적용을 하고 있다고 보시면 될 것 같습니다. 네.
You build to are very high because you are building passenger carrying boats. But how do we now use your experience and knowledge to help the people who are building the smaller boats?
네, 이제 ISO 14001이라든지 9001, 그 다음에 이제 45000들이 있다 보니까요. 환경 문제하고 현재 저희 같은 경우는 이제 이거는 기본적으로 갖고 있는 거지만 각 선박에 이제 디자인할 때 지금 이제 ISO 룰에 맞춘 이제 보건성이라든지 구조, 스트럭처 부분들을 이런 구조 기준을 이제 적용해서 한다고 하면은 지금 스탠다드 기준이 정해져야 배가 안전하다는 상황들을 말씀드릴 수 있을 것 같습니다. 네.
Mr. Kwon, the same question to you.
네, 안녕하십니까. 저 경기도 화성에서 레저 보트만 생산하고 있습니다. 큰 보트들은 아직 안 만들어 봐가지고 규제나 이런 거에 대해서 잘 모르고 있기 때문에 앞으로 좀 많이 배워야 하는 많이 도움을 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 근데 일단 저희 같은 경우는 배를 레저 소형 선박을 많이 만드는데도 불구하고 이게 법률이나 규정 이런 거에 대해서 저조차도 잘 모르고 있는 게 너무 아주 많이 있습니다. 그래서 아까 이제 말씀하신데 되게 배워야 할 점이 많고요. 저희 배가 많이 판매는 되지만 최대한 안전하게 만든다고 이제 침몰이 되지 않게 부력제나 이런 건 전부 다 집어넣고 배는 가라앉지 않지만 그게 법정하고 좀 맞는지 이런 세계 그런 스탠다드하고 맞는지는 또 저조차도 아직 잘 모르고 있습니다. 그래서 오늘 이런 자리를 빌어서 많이 배우겠습니다. 감사합니다.
The industry self-regulating and controlling its destiny, and then suddenly a government organization moving in and doing a top-down regulation system. What would your advice be?
Right. Well, it's interesting. There are many countries which have very specific and detailed legislation in place, and there are other countries like Korea which do not for recreational craft. So the danger is, if there's no legislation, is that there is some terrible accident, and then the government is under pressure to create some new legislation, and that's unfortunately when you tend to have bad legislation because it's made in a rush in reaction to one event. So for an industry that's trying to build itself and build a reputation, it's important even before legislation that it finds a way to build to a safety standard so that these things don't happen. And it's not a difficult thing to achieve. I know that you used the word mountain. It appears like a mountain, but actually compliance isn't as complicated as it seems. You can do a risk assessment. You should do a risk assessment of your product, whatever your product is. But even if that is complicated, the Recreational Craft Directive has 31 requirements, which are very straightforward. For example, stability, it just says the boat should minimize the risk of flooding and capsize. For structural strength, it just says the boat should be strong enough. So what is strong enough?
So this sounds like, to me, what we call in England a working party, where you put a group of people together, some who have skin in the game because they're building boats, and others who can give those people guidance, a small group to start to decide on what the priorities should be. Would that be a good direction?
Exactly. That's the point. This goal setting, as we might call it.
Yeah.
The Korean Association would choose to say, right, these are our targets. We have no legislation, but we want to make sure that members of our association are building boats that minimize the risk of flooding and capsize, that are strong enough. And so therefore encourage and support the use of these standards. As Patrick has already mentioned, the country, Korea, is implementing or suggesting new work items to the international standards. So use those standards, adopt those standards, and promote them strongly in the industry.
Joe, CEO to CEO, we speak the same language. I want to ask you, and this is something that as a CEO we share, the damage that's done to reputation and trust if something goes wrong. Just comment on that issue as a CEO, reputation and trust, because the KMIA now have an organisation, and they have a responsibility, don't they, in that situation? And I don't know what the priorities are, but just talk for a couple of minutes about risk of to reputation and trust if something goes badly wrong.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, that's the thought that keeps the CEOs awake at night. But just to, before I answer that question, to follow on Alistair's point, there is something very important about the fact that governments or regulators will often make poor legislation because they're scared or they're rushing or they're ill-informed. A lot of the work that ICOMIA does through the likes of people like Patrick and Alistair is actually going to inform the governments and to demonstrate that we are a responsible industry, that we are doing lots of research. Last year, or the last 2 years, we've spent over $1 million US dollars researching decarbonisation. And we've taken that work to governments, and they are so desperate for the information because they want to make regulations that will work and will be sensible and will be followed by the industry. And it's that responsibility to your question about being a responsible organisation and a responsible industry. We all want to work together, and this is the core purpose of ICOMIA, to build a safe, sustainable and successful future for our industry. Because if our industry isn't safe or sustainable or successful, then we'll be out of jobs. So as a chief executive
or in prison.
Or in prison. So as a chief executive of any organisation and all of our members, we need to continue to demonstrate that we are working responsibly, that we are working hard to mitigate risk, to avoid accidents happening, but also to demonstrate to the regulators that we are taking every practicable step to make sure that we offer a safe and sustainable future for boating. And that's what keeps me sleeping at night, and that's what helps everybody know that we are working to the best standards, and that's the best you can possibly aspire to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. You and I have known each other for many years when I've been coming here. You are the wise man here. You are the man who listens and thinks. So
Yes.
give me your impressions of this discussion.
감사합니다. 조금 전에 우리 KMI 정 회장님께서 말씀하셨던 거에 약간 오해가 있어서 제가 잠깐 부연 설명을 드리면, 사실 우리나라 레저보트에 관련되는 법령이 지나치게 까다로운 면이 좀 있어요. 그러니까 과거에는 어선을 만드는 데서 출발을 했기 때문에, 심지어는 우리나라의 그 룰을 따라서 배를 만들면 ISO 스탠다드보다 더 배가 무거워져서, 그러니까 스캔틀링이 이제 헤비 스캔틀링이 돼서 이제 오히려 경쟁력이 떨어진다라고까지 이야기를 할 정도로 굉장히 엄격한 규제를 가지고 있거든요. 근데 아마 정 회장께서는 비즈니스를 하시는데 그 다른 멤버들이 그 룰에 맞춰서 설계도 다 하고 룰에 맞춰서 다 제작도 하고 있을 거예요, 회사에서는. 그리고 이제 비즈니스를 하시기 때문에 이제 디테일하게를 잘 몰라서 그런 조금 오해가 있지 않았나라는 생각이 들고요. 추가로 제가 잠깐 한 가지 오늘 RCD 패트릭 그 발표를 보면서, 아까 잠깐 초반에 말씀드렸듯이 우리 정부에서도 한 3년 전부터 이런 다양한 그 표준을 만들기 위해서, 또는 좀 부족한 표준을 새로 만들고 새로운 지침을 만들어서 우리나라 레저보트에 관련되는 제조업체들의 기술을 조금 더 국제적으로 레벨업 시키자라는 연구를 지금 진행 중에 있고요. 근데 그걸 하다 보니까 가장 큰 어려움 중에 하나가, 사실 아직까지 이제 우리나라에서 그 보트들은 잘 아시다시피 룰에서 엄격하게 뭐 KR 그 클래스에서 DMV, 로이드 이런 데서 엄격한 룰로 어느 정도 이제 기준이 이제 만들어져 있는 반면에, 그 개인용 레저 장비들, 카누, 카약 또는 보드, 이런 부분들이 시장이 굉장히 커지고 있는데, 거기에 대한 기준, 뭐 어떤 가이드 같은 게 굉장히 부족하더라고요. 저희들이 이제 연구하는 입장에서는 이제 그런 가이드나 그런 기준이 좀 잘 만들어지면 그걸 저희들이 스타디를 하고 디벨롭을 해서 업체들한테 상당히 도움을 줄 수 있을 것 같은데, 혹시 아이코미아에서 지금 현재 룰에서 다루지 않고 있는, 또는 RCD에서 빠져 있는 그런 이제 개인용 레저 장비들, 조금 전에 말씀드렸던 카누나 보드 같은 것에 대해서 어떤 기술 지침 가이드를 업체하고 같이 만들 계획을 가지고 계신지가 굉장히 궁금합니다.
Patrick and Alistair are probably itching to step up and say that the Recreational Craft Directive doesn't cover, in general terms, sports equipment like canoes and small sailing boats and what have you. And the regulations there are very basic. It's a duty of care regulation in terms, and most of those regulations are controlled and advised by the sport governing bodies, where if they use equipment, it doesn't come under RCD, but it does come under sport governing bodies. So, for example, for paddling sports like canoes and so on, it's a safety issue, and those safety guidelines are provided by the sports organisations. So we can't solve your problem in RCD for canoes, kayaks, stand-up paddleboards, small sailing boats. Those have to be solved and advised by the sport regulators, and I think that's correct, Patrick. You're nodding. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Just to add, it's a very important. It's one of the reasons I showed that slide with a person foiling behind an electric remote craft. Was new technology is very difficult to regulate as such, and just as an example of that was, we've had personal watercraft manufacturers as members, so we engaged with Kawasaki, Yamaha, BLP. And one thing, there's a personal watercraft ISO standard. What there isn't a standard for is exactly this, covering foiling type of craft which are electrically propelled as such. So there are gaps in legislation there that do raise a safety issue, particularly with foiling craft. And it's something we've spoken this morning about guidelines. We mention ISO standards, but there are routes to those ISO standards. ICOMIA has its own standards, and they can write guidelines with our members. So one way of achieving this is to say, we have all these foiling manufacturers making electric surfboards or the like or similar, is try and get them into the same room and have the conversation around, can we outline certain elements in a guideline now to address any concerns? That guideline in a few years' time could change to become an ISO standard or more, but at least get that guidance down in writing, because we know there's a big substantial safety risk there. What we're also seeing in the marketplace is aftermarket add-ons to electrify product that weren't meant to be electric or powered in the first place. So I know today I get frustrated going surfing because people come past me with powered surfboards, and not the foiling type, but just an add-on fin system that powers the craft. And that's good. It's like electric bicycle technology. It helps people bring into the industry. But we have to recognize the certain elements of safety that those may impose on other boat users or other people in the water. So it's a way of recognizing that and creating guidelines that are agreed by industry. So it's not Patrick and Alistair sitting in a room what they think. We want to draw out what manufacturers want in those certain guidelines or standards.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Anyone want to ask a question?
저는 국무조정실 규제혁신추진단의 전문위원으로 근무하고 있는 이봉길입니다. 앞에 좀 시간이 좀 늦게 참여를 해서 앞에 주제 발표에 대해서 정확하게 듣지를 못해서 이런 질문을 드리게 되는지 모르겠습니다만은 지금까지 토론 이야기가 나왔던 자료 중심으로 해서 말씀을 좀 드리고자 하는 것은 먼저 사회 그 보시는 우리 교수님 아직 미처 인사를 못 드렸습니다만은 미리 그 설명은 아까 해석은 좀 해 주셨는데요. 두 분 은성에서 오신 우리 사장님과 화성에서 오신 그 분이 두 분의 이야기가 다르게 이야기하신 부분은 현행 우리나라 법상에서는 레저 선박을 20톤 이상 기준으로 해서 20톤 이상은 프레즈보트로 해서 지금 법이 엄격하게 좀 되어가 있고요. 그 이하의 경우에는 지금 화성에서 오신 분의 경우에는 특히 5톤 미만의 경우에는 규제를 좀 완화를 시켜줘서 아까 그런 말씀을 나오신 것 같고요. 오늘 이 자리에서 제가 말씀드리고자 하는 것은 오히려 우리나라 지금 현장에서 이야기는 규제가 너무 강화가 되어 있어서 국제 기준보다도 더 강화가 되어지고 있고, 그 다음에 검사 과정이 너무 까다롭다고 보니까 산업 발전에 저해가 되고 있다. 이것을 좀 완화시켜달라는 이런 요청에 따라서 저희들이 지금 검토를 하고 있는데요. 현재 지금 국제적으로 국제 기준, 국제 표준에 따라서 만들어진 기자재, 장비 이것을 우리 국내에 들어와서 선박에 탑재를 하려고 하면은 국내법에 따라서 똑같은 검사를 하고 다시 승인을 받도록 이렇게 되어져가 있습니다. 이것을 국제적으로 승인된 자재에 대해서는 그대로 탑재를 했을 때 혹시 국제적으로 다른 나라에서는 그런 식으로 국제 통용이 되는 것을 그 나라 자국법에 의해서 재검사를 하지 않고 바로 탑재를 하고 있는지 또 그렇게 바로 허용을 했을 때 문제가 있는지 그런 부분에 대해서 혹시 누군가 설명을 좀 해주시면 좋겠습니다.
Yeah, so I think we should make it clear ISO standards are still non-mandatory, meaning they are voluntary means. Perhaps there are some exceptions to that, so they are hard and fast. Some standards are mandatory, but only one or two, I believe, Alistair. So really, it's up to the country to adopt some of those standards so they can, in Europe, adopt their own standards for their national legislation. But there is no absolute requirement for a country to say we have to use that standard. It's there for use. It's a recommendation. It makes the compliance process easier because what Alistair's covered, and he mentioned things like the technical file or a risk assessment. My experience, and we meet with market surveillance authorities in Europe, if you don't use the ISO standards, because you don't have to, it does flag an extra bit of question mark around how you met some of these requirements. So there will be a little bit more scrutiny or inspection of your methods that you used if you didn't use an ISO standard. So although it's completely voluntary to use, it's a means that almost guarantees, I don't want to say easier path, but it's a shorter path to compliance.
Alistair, before you comment, do you just want to comment on how the CE plate is used?
Yeah, so ultimately, and Alistair can...
First of all, explain
add.
what the CE plate is, because you and I know,
Yeah.
but we want the audience to understand.
So I mentioned this in the keynote. Was one of the things you sort of have to have in terms of compliance, in terms of marking, is the CE mark.
And it's an aluminium plate in the boat.
Yeah.
And just describe what it says.
So that CE mark is on your builder's plate, and effectively it shows it's literally a CE. I think you're familiar with it from other products. What it doesn't mean, and there's association there that says CE is made in Europe. It's not that. It means that the product, wherever it was made, it could be made in my home country in South Africa, and it's placed on the market in EU, it has to have that mark, and that mark shows that it's in compliance with the requirements. And that goes on the builder's plate. And there are a whole lot of other things. There's this craft identification number that needs to go on the builder's plate. There's a sort of max number of persons, and there's a max engine
size.
Engine size.
And also the
yeah.
CE plate will also define within a number whether the boat is inshore or offshore use.
Correct, and that's an important
Perhaps you
part.
just might to make that clear.
Yeah, that's a very important part because a manufacturer doesn't always know where their vessel might be used. So there is a watercraft design category, and there are 4, an A, B, C, and a D. In some countries there are an E as well, but in Europe it basically A is the highest level you can get. So we don't need to
go
get
anywhere.
the details, but you can go anywhere, and D's the lowest. But what happens is a lot of people don't want to be a D, they want to be a C or a B because and they use it as a marketing tool. And it's a bit of a trap, which Alistair can also explain, that you don't always want to be in a higher design category. But that gives you an indication, so a market surveillance person in Europe can look at a product at a boat show, at the builder's plate, can recognize the CE mark. The European notified body, if they're involved in the assessment, will also have their code on there. So, and that, together with the craft identification number, will link back to the manufacturer. So there's a form of traceability, and it shows exactly what Tim's highlighted, the design category that the vessel can be used in.
Tim, can I jump in?
Please do.
There was a part of the question
Got
that
3 minutes.
hasn't been answered yet. The gentleman raised a question at the end about how did countries manage when they didn't have legislation for small craft, which is an interesting question. I don't think there's a black and white answer, but if you look at boating statistics in countries before and after they implemented accident statistics for before and after implementation of legislation. You'll notice in the case of recreational craft directive, over about 10 years, the number of deaths halved. That's my impression. That's I've not looking at a number of country and ICOMIA statistics. That's what I've noticed. So legislation does bring results. In terms of how you design your legislation, was another part of your question. I've been asked that question by a number of governments around the world of how to implement it, and what's interesting is most governments are adopting the approach of the Recreational Craft Directive, because it sets a goal strong enough, sufficient, and then you choose which standards you use to apply. And as Patrick says, very few of the standards are mandatory, because if you make the standard mandatory, what happens when you have new technology? Well, we have no standard. So the standards are optional. You choose the most appropriate standard, and if there is no standard, then you can invent your own system based on a risk assessment for how you address.
But you have to be very expert and knowledgeable to do that.
Exactly, and that's where we come in.
Yeah.
So the notified bodies, that we become that means of judging, being the referee. Is the risk assessment correct?
So this side of the panel, in answer to your question, would be, I know from my experience of working here for many years that people in government like case studies. They like to see examples that are established and meet a standard. So your advice would be, what case study, what should the Korean government study to make sure that they get their benchmarks right? Because if they ask the builders, it's like asking a thief how you open a door, isn't it? But basically, I mean, in the nicest possible way, what should they be looking at as their case study to use as an example?
But well, as I say, the Recreational Craft Directive, and if you look, UK uses it, not in the EU anymore. Australia and New Zealand recognise it. Saudi Arabia have just adopted a cut and paste of the European regulations, because they are very straightforward, just strong enough, sufficient, and choose standards, which makes it very uncomplicated, actually.
And I would add to that, if I may, governments will look to industry associations to say, we as an industry approve this as being the appropriate measure, the appropriate standard. Because if the government speaks to one boat builder who might be under investigation, then of course there's a degree of cynicism or skepticism. But if you as an industry say, no, we all agree this is the appropriate standard and these have been followed, you're in a very strong, robust, informed position.
So in answer to your question, RCD, Recreational Craft Directive, is the way that you should be looking. Would you like to comment?
기본적으로 수출을 할 계획을 가지고 있는 그 메이커들은 이제 반드시 그 RCD 기준을 준수를 해야 되겠죠. 아마 점진적으로 이제 아직까지 우리나라 그 레저보트 조선소들이 이제 뭐 이렇게 성장하는 단계이기 때문에 유럽에 수출하는 회사들 같은 경우는 당연히 RCD 기준을 만족해야 될 거고요. 국내 판매를 중심으로 한다 그러면은 아직까지는 조금 준비를 좀 더 해야 되지 않을까? 뭐 그런 생각을 가지고 있습니다. 서 대표.
아까 그 국무조정실에서 그 말씀을 좀 해주셔서 이제 저희도 지금 같이 이제 연사분들로 이렇게 참석하신 분이 이제 산업발전을 위해서 말씀을 하셨어요. 사실은 이제 아까 국무조정실에서도 그걸 여쭤보신 거거든요. 이게 이 CE 마크가 있는 제품을 우리 한국에서 건조하는 선박에 이게 달 수 있는 기준이 되느냐 안 되느냐를 궁금하셔서 여쭤보셨던 것 같아요. 근데 이제 또 소통의 문제이기 때문에 이제 이게 정확히 안 되지만 지금 아까 말씀하신 것처럼 한국 법령은 굉장히 까다로워요. 지금 스탠다드 이상으로 규제가 너무 강해서 지금 지금 내저 선박을 만들어서 납품하기가 좀 힘든 실정이라고 보시면 될 것 같고요. 이게 지금 이 자리에서 전부 다 해결될 문제가 아니라 전부 다 좀 펼쳐놓고들 하나씩 짚어봐야 되는 문제들이 있습니다. 그래서 제가 봐서는 C 마크라든지 아니면 아약서 멤버에서 형식 승인을 받은 제품이 있다면은 그거는 적용할 수 있는 룰들을 만들어가는 게 맞지 않을까 싶습니다.
Thank you. I think our time. I'd like to thank particularly thank the panel contributions. Think we've started, which is the of a discussion. But the big thing to remember is that now that KMI, your association, is formed, and it's a full member of ICOMIA, there's a lot of support available for you. So you're not on this journey on your own. You've got experienced people, as you will have heard today around the panel, that can help you, can advise you, and that can guide you on the right road. So thank you, panel. Thank you, audience. Thank you.